The smell of damp earth and crushed eucalyptus leaves always hit the back of my throat before the bell above the shop door even finished ringing. Outside, the Portland rain was turning the pavement into a slate mirror, but inside this brick-and-mortar greenhouse, the air stayed thick and warm. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets of my charcoal coat, watching the sharp line of Madeline Gardner's shoulders as she stood behind the counter. She didn't look up from her ledger, her ink-stained thumb tracing a column of numbers with a rhythm that belonged to someone trying to outrun a storm. "The commercial zoning tax assessment came back," I said, my voice cutting through the humid silence of the shop. I didn't do introductions. We had passed that stage 3 months ago when I rented the small, high-ceilinged loft directly above her botanical store. Madeline didn't flinch, but her blue ink pen halted, leaving a small, dark pool on the grain of the paper. She was 36, 7 years older than me, and possessed a quiet brilliance that usually made the rest of this chaotic city look like it was spinning backward. But today, the shadow under her eyes was deeper, a faint purple bruise of exhaustion that no amount of green tea could mask. She rubbed her right temple with 2 fingers, a specific microtel she only used when the shop's daily operational ledger refused to balance. "I saw the notice, Theo," she murmured, her voice steady but light, like dry birch wood. "Vance Properties adjusted the triple net lease terms again. They're claiming the roof repair from last winter is an operational expense chargeable to the tenant." I pulled my right hand from my pocket, stepped up to the old timber counter, and reached for the document before she could protect it. My thumb brushed the edge of her fingers, a clean, grounding touch that lasted less than a second, but it felt like dropping an anchor into mud. Her skin was cold from arranging winter ferns. I didn't offer a platitude or a soft word. My mind didn't work in the currency of comfort. Instead, I focused on the cold reality of the print. "Arthur Vance is using an illegal amortization schedule," I said, pointing to line 42 with my silver pen. "He's front-loading the capital expenditure into a single quarter to force an artificial default. It's a classic squeeze play." She looked at me then, her dark gray eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent bulb above us. A sudden gust of wind rattled the glass panes of the front door, making the hanging ferns sway like green pendulums. The stakes were written in the margin of her checkbook. If she couldn't dispute this $40,000 assessment by the end of the month, Vance would seize her inventory and terminate her occupancy. "You know that feeling when the floor drops out from under you, and you realize the safety net you built was just a net of loose twine?" That was the look in her eyes, and it made my jaw tighten until my teeth clicked. "I can handle the store, Theo," she said, pulling the ledger back toward herself with a sudden defensive jerk. "You have your own clients at the firm. I'm just your landlady." "You're an inefficient bookkeeper," I replied bluntly, though my chest tightened at the distance she was trying to maintain. "And I don't like living above a vacant storefront." She opened her mouth to argue, but the bell above the door jangled with a harsh, aggressive clang. Arthur Vance walked in, his expensive leather boots leaving greasy tracks on Madeline's freshly swept cedar floors. He didn't take off his coat. He just let the rain drip off the hem onto a display of rare orchids. Behind him stood a man with a clipboard, his corporate inspector. "Madeline," Vance said, his smile not reaching his small, sharp eyes. "I see you got the amended invoice. I need the signed acknowledgement by 5 o'clock today, or the eviction notice gets posted on the glass tomorrow morning." Madeline stood up straight, her fingers gripping the edge of the wood until her knuckles turned white. She was a woman who had built this sanctuary from nothing after her previous business partner had walked away with the capital, leaving her in near financial ruin. She wasn't a damsel, but Vance was using a legal crowbar to pry her loose from her life's work. The lease states capital improvements are landlord obligations, Arthur, Madeline said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a hard, professional weight. You can't retroactively reclassify a structural beam replacement as standard maintenance. Vance chuckled, a dry sound that matched the grey Portland sky. Read paragraph 9 again, Maddie. My lawyers wrote that clause to be flexible. If you can't pay the assessment, I have a boutique coffee franchise ready to take the square footage by November 1st. I stepped sideways, my broader frame moving between Vance and the counter, physically blocking his line of sight to Madeline without making a single aggressive gesture. I kept my hands in my pockets, my posture perfectly still, absorbing the tension in the room until the space went completely quiet, except for the steady drip of Vance's coat. Paragraph 9 relies on the State Building Code definition of structural integrity, I said, my tone flat, devoid of any anger or theatrics. I spent the last 3 hours reviewing Vance Properties' public filings. You didn't file a permit for that beam replacement. You logged it as an emergency patch to avoid the city inspection fee. Vance's smile faltered, his eyes darting to my face. Who exactly are you? I'm the tenant in 2B, I said, pulling a folded sheet of ledger paper from my breast pocket and laying it flat on the counter. And as of 10 minutes ago, I'm the forensic accountant of record for Gardner Botanicals. This is your formal dispute notice. You have 48 hours to provide the certified contractor invoices, or we file for an injunction in county court. The inspector behind Vance lowered his clipboard. Vance looked at the paper, then back at me, his jaw working. This is a private matter between a landlord and a tenant, kid. Don't get cute with contracts you don't own. I own the numbers, I said simply. And right now, your numbers are a liability. Vance glared at me for 3 long seconds, the silence in the shop stretching until the hum of the refrigerator in the back grew loud. Then he turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled against its lead housing. I turned back to Madeline. Her breathing was shaky, her shoulders dropping 2 inches as she let out a long, silent exhale. She looked at the paper I had placed on the counter, then at me. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, her eyes dark with a mixture of relief and fear. Vance doesn't play fair. He can make your lease up there miserable too. He can try, I said, reaching down to close her ink-stained ledger for her. But he doesn't know how to hide his tracks. Go upstairs and make some tea, Madeline. Leave the books down here. She reached out, her hand hovering over mine for a fraction of a second, before she pulled it back and nodded, her movements small and exhausted. I watched her walk toward the back stairs, her steps heavy with the weight of a 12-week battle she had been fighting completely alone. Looking back now, I realized that was the exact moment the cold spreadsheet of my life began to shift into something I couldn't quantify with a decimal point. By the next morning, the rain had settled into a steady grey fog that clung to the brick walls of the alley. I sat at the small kitchen table in my loft, surrounded by 3 separate stacks of Vance Properties financial disclosures from the last 5 years. My head throbbed from the lack of sleep, a familiar dull ache behind my eyes that usually accompanied a deep dive into corporate fraud. Marcus, my senior partner at the firm, had called twice before dawn, warning me not to get tangled in a local real estate dispute when we had a major corporate audit due in Chicago. It's a distraction, Theo, Marcus had said over the static heavy line. You're top 1% in asset recovery. Why are you spending your nights looking at property taxes for a flower shop? Because the landlord is lying, I had told him before hanging up. I stood up, walked down the narrow wooden stairs to the shop floor, and let myself in using the key Madeline had given me when I first moved in. The shop was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps through the foggy windows. Madeline was already there, sitting on a low stool by the potting bench, surrounded by a mountain of old paper bags, receipts, and handwritten utility bills. She looked small against the backdrop of massive monstera leaves. "Clara told me Vance's lawyers called the shop's landline at midnight," Madeline said without looking up, her hands sorting through a stack of yellowed invoices from 2022. Clara was her 19-year-old apprentice, a local college student who managed the weekend shifts and spent most of her time trying to fix Madeline's social media presence. "They're threatening to audit my gross sales to claim additional rent under the percentage lease clause." "Let them," I said, stepping closer. I noticed she had forgotten to turn on the space heater under the bench. Her fingers were slightly blue at the tips. Without saying a word, I walked over to the wall, adjusted the old thermostat until the furnace kicked on with a low roar, and then dragged a wooden chair over to her workspace. "They can't claim percentage rent on digital pre-orders shipped outside the county. I checked your initial contract." I sat down, pulled her messy stack of receipts toward me, and immediately began organizing them by fiscal quarter. My movements were precise, methodical, my fingers snapping the paper straight with a sharp sound. For the next 2 hours, the only noise in the room was the rhythmic clicking of my calculator and the steady patter of rain against the glass. "You're very efficient," Madeline said softly, watching me match 3-year-old credit card receipts to her bank statements. "It's almost frightening." "Numbers don't have emotions," I said, not looking up. "They don't get tired, and they don't change their mind based on who's asking. They just tell the truth." "Is that why you like them?" she asked. I paused, my thumb resting on a receipt for organic fertilizer. The question was too close, pulling at the edge of the void I kept carefully locked behind my professional credentials. I had spent my entire 20-something life fixing corporate balances for people who forgot my name the moment the IRS audit cleared. I was 29, successful, and completely untethered to anything but my ledger. "They're reliable," I said, my voice dropping into a lower, flatter register. "People aren't." Madeline didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. She reached over and placed a fresh cup of black coffee right beside my calculator. She didn't ask how I took it. She had simply noticed over the last few weeks that I never touched the sugar or cream in the break room. It was an act of service that didn't require an explanation. A quiet acknowledgement that made the back of my neck feel strangely warm, despite the draft in the shop. The micro joy of that hot coffee carried us through the next hour, until the front doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't Vance, but a courier in a yellow slicker. He dropped a thick white envelope on the counter, requested a signature from Madeline, and disappeared back into the downpour. Madeline opened the envelope with a pair of shears. Her face went pale, the small amount of color she had gained from the warm coffee draining instantly. She dropped the paper onto the desk between us. It was an official 5-day notice to quit or pay, signed by a county bailiff. Vance had moved up the timeline, using a clause that claimed tenant non-compliance with safety standards due to the uninspected structural beam. "He's giving me 5 days, Theo," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly as she gripped the edges of her shirt. 5 days to move $10,000 worth of living plants in the middle of a Portland autumn. I can't do it. I'll lose everything." I took the document from her hands, my eyes scanning the fine print at triple speed. My forensic training kicked in, filtering out the legal intimidation to look for the structural mechanics of the trap. Vance had used a fast-track summary proceeding meant for commercial hazards. He thought he had found a loophole that would bypass the standard 30-day dispute window. He skipped the mandatory mediation step required for historic district properties, I said, my voice cutting through her growing panic like a scalpel. He's gambling that you don't know the municipal code update from last January. Look here, line 14. I stood up, walked to my briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. For the next 45 minutes, I didn't speak. I compiled her tax history, her rent receipts, and the city's own code violation log for Vance Properties' other holdings. My hands flew across the keyboard, generating a 60-page counterfiling that completely dismantled Vance's summary timeline. "Is that going to stop him?" Clara asked from the doorway. She had just arrived for her shift, her yellow umbrella dripping onto the mat. "It won't stop him permanently," I said, closing the laptop with a firm click. "But it changes the rules of the engagement. He wanted a quick eviction in the dark. Now he has to face a formal administrative review on the record." I looked at Madeline. She was staring at me, her hands no longer shaking. The dynamic between us had settled into a quiet rhythm. She was the storm of creative energy that kept this beautiful green sanctuary alive, and I was the stone wall blocking the wind. "Thank you, Theo," she said, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me look away first, my eyes tracking back to the safety of the printout. "Don't thank me yet," I said, sliding the counterfiling into a protective sleeve. "The review is set for November 24th. We have exactly 3 weeks to find the definitive proof that Vance knew that beam was sound before he invoiced you. If we fail, the lease terminates automatically." The next week passed without a single word from Vance, a heavy, silent truce that felt more dangerous than an open fight. The rain stopped for 2 days, leaving the city trapped in a cold, snapping frost that required us to keep the shop's old iron wood stove burning around the clock. I had moved my workstation down to the small desk in the back of the store, my spreadsheets now sharing space with terracotta pots and trimmings of willow bark. "You need to eat something that didn't come out of a cellophane wrapper," Madeline said on Thursday evening, placing a bowl of hot potato soup next to my ledger. I looked up from a line of building depreciation metrics. The clock on the wall showed 10 p.m. Clara had gone home hours ago, and the shop was quiet, illuminated only by the amber glow of the wood stove. "I have 2 more years of Vance's corporate tax returns to cross-reference," I said, my hand staying on my pen. "His shell companies are overlapping in a way that suggests he's hiding liquid assets from his lenders." "The numbers will still be there in 20 minutes, Theo," she said, sitting on the opposite side of the desk. She didn't pressure me. She just waited, her presence a calm, steady weight in the room. I laid the pen down, the metal clicking against the oak surface. My shoulders were stiff, my lower back aching from 12 hours on the hard chair. I picked up the spoon and took a bite. The soup was thick, seasoned with fresh rosemary from the display window. It was the first real food I had tasted in 48 hours, and the relief of it was physical. A sudden warmth that spread from my chest outward. "Your assistant Clara is concerned about her tuition," I remarked between bites, choosing a safe, logistical topic over the silence that was stretching between us. "She mentioned her work-study check was delayed." "I know," Madeline sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "The bank freeze Vance initiated on our operational account has made everything tight. I prioritized the inventory suppliers so we wouldn't lose the winter stock, but it means I'm behind on my own draw." I watched her for a moment. She didn't complain, didn't use the language of a victim. She was 36, managing a complex, small business in a predatory market, and her primary concern was a 19-year-old part-timer's college fund. My internal monologue, usually a sharp critique of corporate inefficiency, went completely quiet. "I adjusted the payroll schedule yesterday," I told her, putting the spoon down. "I routed the boutique's online gift card revenue through a secondary merchant account I cleared last week. Clara's check will clear tomorrow morning at 8. Madeline paused, her eyes widening slightly. "You didn't ask me for permission to shift the routing." "It was an emergency cash flow triage," I said, my voice remaining flat, though my throat felt dry. If Clara quits, your operational capacity drops by 30%, which increases the likelihood of a lease default. It was a logical correction. Theo, she murmured, her voice carrying that soft, birchwood tone that always made my chest feel like it was losing its armor. You didn't do it for the operational capacity. You did it because you knew she was stressed. I don't make decisions based on stress, I lied, looking back down at the tax forms. I make them based on risk mitigation. She didn't argue, but a small, knowing smile touched the corner of her lips. The first real smile I had seen on her face since the eviction notice arrived. It was a micro-joy that felt heavier than a win in court. Our quiet was shattered 20 minutes later by a sharp metallic snap from the front of the store. I was on my feet before the sound finished echoing through the rafter beams. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the wood stove, my body moving on instinct, keeping Madeline behind me as we walked into the main showroom. The display window was intact, but the front door was slightly ajar, the brass lock assembly hanging loose from the wood. On the floor lay a black leather document case, the one I kept at my desk in the back. It had been pulled from the drawer and dropped near the exit. Someone was inside, Madeline whispered, her hand reaching out to touch my sleeve, her grip tight and anchoring. I stepped to the doorway, my eyes tracking the wet boot prints on the cedar floor. They were the same size as the tracks left by Vance's inspector 2 weeks ago. I checked the lock. The latch had been shimmed with a piece of thin plastic. They weren't here to steal the inventory, I said, kneeling down to inspect the document case. The brass latches were scratched, but the lock had held. They were looking for my work papers. Vance realized I'm digging into his primary construction loans. Did they get them? Madeline asked, her gray eyes dark with fear as she looked at the broken door. No, I said, standing up and sliding the case under my arm. My voice was tight, the practical romantic in me turning cold and methodical. I don't leave active evidence in an unreinforced drawer. I keep the master drives in my loft. I looked at her, noticing her slight shiver from the cold air rushing through the open door. I didn't offer a dramatic speech about safety. Instead, I pulled my heavy wool coat off the peg by the door and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was twice her size, wrapping her in a dark, heavy shield that smelled of old paper and rain. We're changing the security protocol tonight, I said, pulling a spare deadbolt from my tool bag behind the counter. I'm installing a commercial-grade Medico cylinder on this frame. From now on, nobody enters this space after 6 p.m. without a dual signature confirmation. She nodded from inside the depths of my coat, her fingers gripping the lapels. You should lock your door tonight, Theo, she whispered, her voice carrying a sudden vulnerable weight that had nothing to do with contracts or leases. I paused, my hand resting on the brass cylinder of the new lock. I looked down at her, her face framed by the dark wool of my coat, her eyes reflecting the amber light of the street lamp outside. My throat tightened, my internal code wrestling with the sudden, magnetic pull of her proximity. But then how will you get in? She whispered. The sentence hung in the humid air of the shop, heavier than the frost outside. I didn't reach out to touch her. I kept my hands disciplined, my fingers tightening around the cold metal of the tool. I have the master key, Madeline, I said softly, my voice steady but rough. I always keep a way in. By mid-November, the frost had turned into a relentless, icy rain that froze the gutters and made the walk to the county courthouse a hazardous slog. The pressure was mounting. Vance's lawyers had filed 3 separate motions to dismiss our administrative review, each one more aggressive than the last. My firm had noticed my absence. Marcus had officially reassigned the Chicago audit to a junior partner, his voice cold when he left the final voicemail. You're trading a career partnership for a tenant dispute, Ortega. Make sure she's worth the tax. I didn't answer the message. I didn't need to. Every answer I required was written in the quiet way Madeline kept the shop running, despite the frozen pipes and the empty bank accounts. On the morning of November 16th, the second major escalation hit us. I was in the back storage room, checking the inventory valuation metrics against her supplier invoices, when Clara ran in, her face red from the cold outside. "The delivery truck from the northern nursery just turned around," Clara said, her breath catching in her throat. "The driver said Vance Properties bought the outstanding commercial debt on our transport supplier." "They won't unload the winter pines unless we pay the full balance in cash right now." Madeline walked into the storage room, her apron stained with soil, her hair pinned up in a loose, hurried knot. She looked at me, her gray eyes clear but guarded. This was the real-world threat Vance had been building toward, a physical blockade of her supply chain. "The balance is $12,000, Madeline said, her voice dropping into that tight professional register. "We don't have that liquidity until the weekend sales clear." "I do," I said, closing the spreadsheet on my tablet. "No, Theo," she said immediately, stepping closer, her hand rising as if to block my path. "I told you from day one, this is a business, not a charity. I don't take personal loans from my tenants." "It's not a personal loan," I said, my voice flat, empty of any emotional negotiation. "It's a strategic asset purchase. I bought the transport company's underlying equipment lien through my personal LLC 20 minutes ago when I saw Vance's corporate entity flag the account. He doesn't own the debt, Madeline. I do." She froze, her hand stopping mid-air. Clara looked between the two of us, her mouth slightly open. "You... what?" Madeline whispered. "I read his acquisition schedule last night," I explained, standing up and straightening my sleeves. "He used a standard non-recourse clause that left the equipment title open. I forced a rewrite of the vendor terms by matching their outstanding tax liability to a clearinghouse credit I manage. The truck is currently turning back around. They'll unload in 10 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the refrigeration unit. Madeline stared at me, her chest rising and falling with sharp, controlled breaths. She didn't thank me, and she didn't get angry. She simply looked at me as if she were trying to decode a language she had never heard spoken aloud. "You're top 1%, aren't you?" she asked softly, using the exact phrase Marcus had used on the phone. "You don't just fix small-town books." "I find errors," I said, picking up my pen. Vance made a large one. The practical win of that delivery carried us through the afternoon, a micro-joy that filled the shop with the fresh, clean scent of Douglas fir and winter cedar. By 5 p.m., the inventory was safely stacked in the courtyard, protected by heavy canvas tarps I had secured before the rain started again. I was working at the counter when the phone rang. It was the county clerk's office. The administrative review had been moved up 24 hours due to a scheduling conflict with the district judge. The hearing was tomorrow morning at 9. "We aren't fully prepared," Madeline said, her voice tight as she stood by the window, watching the rain turn to sleet against the glass. "We still don't have the original building permit from 1998 to prove Vance's father grandfathered the structural layout." "We don't need the 1998 permit," I said, standing up and gathering my files into my leather case. "We have something better. We have his current ledger." I walked over to her, stopping exactly 2 feet away, respecting the space she required, but letting my presence act as a shield against the freezing darkness outside. "Go upstairs, Madeline," I said gently, my voice dropping its professional edge for her ears only. "Sleep for 6 hours. I'll be at my desk if the lock clicks." She looked up at me, her gray eyes dark with a mixture of trust and an unspoken longing that she didn't have the words to name. And frankly, neither did I. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cuff of my sleeve. A brief, grounding touch that felt like the only real thing in a world made of paper and ink. "Don't stay up all night, Theo," she whispered. "I only need until 4 a.m., I said. The county courthouse boardroom was cold, smelled of pine cleaner and wet umbrellas, and was illuminated by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that made everyone look like they were standing in a hospital corridor. Arthur Vance sat across the mahogany table, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers in sharp gray suits. The administrative referee, an older woman with a pair of reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, was busy scanning our 60-page counterfiling. "This is a straightforward non-compliance issue, Madam Referee," Vance's lead attorney said, his voice smooth and practiced. "The tenant failed to verify the structural integrity of a load-bearing element, creating a public safety hazard that voids the lease under paragraph 9. Madeline sat beside me, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded flat on the table. She wore a dark blue blazer, her hair pulled back into a neat, professional braid. She looked calm, but I could see the tiny tremor in her right thumb, the anxiety she was trying to hide from the room. "The tenant has provided an extensive documentation chain," the referee observed, her glasses clicking against her file. "Mr. Ortega, you're representing Gardner Botanicals as their financial officer. What is your response to the structural safety claim?" I stood up, my charcoal suit pressed, my silver pen held firmly between my fingers. I didn't make a speech about small businesses or community heritage. I didn't look at Vance's smirk. I looked at the referee. "Our response is written in Vance Properties' own general ledger from 3 weeks ago," I said, opening my leather case and pulling out a single sheet of green-lined paper. "I spent the last 48 hours tracing the supply chain invoices for Vance's primary residential development on the east side." Vance's smirk vanished. His lead attorney shifted in his chair. "This is completely irrelevant to the commercial lease at hand," the attorney cut in sharply. "It's entirely relevant under the state's clean hands doctrine," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Line 24 of this ledger shows that Vance Properties purchased 4 structural steel beams from the same contractor who repaired Madeline Gardner's roof. He billed the commercial shop for the replacement, but the physical delivery manifest, which my client retrieved from the shipping depot yesterday, proves the steel was delivered to his residential site." Madeline reached into her folder, pulled out a stack of yellowed delivery receipts with official timestamps, and laid them flat on the center of the mahogany table. It was her power moment, executed with perfect timing and calm facts. "The beam in my shop was never replaced because it didn't need to be," Madeline said, her voice ringing clear across the quiet room. "Arthur Vance used a standard maintenance check to fabricate an invoice, diverted the material to his own personal project, and then used the unfiled permit as leverage to force an artificial eviction." The referee leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she compared the delivery manifest to Vance's corporate ledger. The room went completely silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heating vent in the corner. Vance's lawyers looked at each other, their smooth confidence evaporating in a fraction of a second. "Is this manifest accurate, Mr. Vance?" the referee asked, her voice dropping into a dangerous, legal chill. Vance opened his mouth, his face turning an angry, mottled red, but his lead attorney grabbed his forearm, stopping him before he could speak on the record. We request a brief recess to consult with our client," the attorney muttered, his hands already gathering his documents. "There's no need for a recess," I said, stepping forward and laying a final document down in front of Vance. "This is a formal counteroffer under the original lease terms. You will scrap the capital expenditure invoice, release the freeze on Gardner Botanicals' operational account, and sign a 5-year lease extension at the current market rate. If you refuse, This documentation chain goes to the State Attorney General's Fraud Division at noon today. The visual staging of the finale was clean, stripped of any theatrical drama. It was just a scrapped contract tossed into a recycling bin by Vance's own lawyer, and a fresh 2-page addendum laid flat on the mahogany table. Vance gripped his pen, his hand shaking slightly with suppressed rage, and signed his name on the line. He didn't look at Madeline, and he didn't look at me. He stood up and rushed out of the room, his lawyers trailing behind him like gray shadows. The referee looked at Madeline and smiled. "The dispute is resolved, Ms. Gardner. The administrative review is closed." We walked out of the courthouse into a Portland afternoon that had finally broken into a clear, crisp blue sky. The puddles on the steps reflected the sudden sunlight, making the old granite steps look like they were lined with silver. Clara was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, holding a fresh bouquet of winter jasmine from the shop. "We won?" Clara asked, her eyes wide. "We won," Madeline said, her voice dropping its professional armor, replaced by a deep, emotional relief that made her look 5 years younger. She turned to me, her gray eyes locked onto mine with a finality that felt like dropping the anchor for the last time. In front of Clara and the passing crowd of city workers, she took a step closer, breaking our 2-foot boundary rule, and reached out to take my hand. Her fingers were warm now, wrapped tightly around mine, transferring a sudden, beautiful stability that stopped the world from spinning. It wasn't an exploration. It was an arrival. "Thank you, partner," she whispered. I didn't make a speech about numbers. I didn't look back at the courthouse. I just held her hand, my fingers tightening in a quiet promise that didn't need a ledger to prove its worth. Looking back at the void of my 20-something life, I realized that some balances can't be found in a column of metrics. They're found when you finally stop running and realize you've already come home. Closing thoughts. You know, looking back at Theo and Madeline's story, it reminds me of a universal truth about relationship values. Healthy love isn't about the dramatic highs or the chaotic passion of a storm. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up with clear boundaries when the world tries to push you under. Real connection doesn't require you to shrink yourself to fit someone else's ledger. It builds a bigger space where both of you can stand together. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.